So we've been fighting the fight as the Fraternal Order of Police for a decade now, basically pushing back against folks who want to reduce or eliminate mandatory minimums.
You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day. Try to run, try to hide, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side.
Listen, I know it's late. Thank you for coming. I appreciate you taking the time. First off, walk us back. For the people that don't know you, what do you do? Like, what's your place in Boise PD? What was your place? What's your place now? Where are you with, I mean, obviously, there's a huge problem with drug enforcement, and there's a huge debate currently raging about adding things like fentanyl to mandatory minimums. Walk me back through, first off, who you are and how you came to this.
Okay. So I am a transplant from back east, from New York, and I came out to Idaho for a better place to live. And that was 23 years ago. And so for the last 23 years, I've been a law enforcement officer in the state of Idaho, working for a couple of different departments. Much of my career with the Boise Police Department as a detective, as a gang detective, as a violent crimes detective, and also doing some counterterrorism work. And so I've dabbled in a lot of different areas, but pretty much my mainstay has been the violent crimes in Boise and in the area. And I recently retired. And so now I'm a retired cop. So I'm kind of getting used to that life and kind of, what that means and what that's all about. And my other role that I play that's separate from the department, and nothing that I say here is actually reflective of what the Boise Police believe. This is
That's a good disclaimer.
yeah, you gotta be honest about it. Is the Fraternal Order of Police, and so I've been a member of the legislative committee for the Fraternal Order of Police, the state, for a number of years, and for the last several years, I've been the law enforcement chair for the FOP, Idaho State FOP.
Great. So you've been here for a long time. You've been in the law enforcement for a long time, right? You've also been here through like the greatest growth Idaho has seen, right? If you've been here, 20, 30 years, it's really the kind of thing where like 20, 30 years ago, like back in 1993, this was not a booming, thriving place where transplants were flocking to. Like how has law enforcement changed in that time?
Well, I think Idaho law enforcement is reflective of some of the best practices that I've seen in different parts of the country where I've lived, and I've lived in other places. And that's not putting them down. It's just looking at Idaho in terms of kind of the culture of Idaho, the expectation that we hold each other accountable. And there's a lot of that in law enforcement in Idaho. And, the citizens, at least the ones I've dealt with over the years, for the most part, expect it. They expect us to take the moral high ground, to do our job, without favor, and just do it right and seek the truth. And that's what we try to do. And that was what was attractive to me joining law enforcement in Idaho. What I've seen in terms of the last couple of decades is simply the growth that we would expect as Idaho grows, as the Treasure Valley grows. We see more people coming in. There's going to be more volume of things going on. I don't see a huge change yet in terms of, like some dramatic change. And I think that's partly because of how we handle and how we do law enforcement, in the state and in the region. Is when there's something bad happening, we recognize what it is and we go after it. And we do good case work, and we put together our investigations, and we arrest people and we hold them accountable. It's really simple. It's actually very simple. And we're responsive to the public's expectations. And probably the most important part of it all is that we all live here. And so we want to live in a nice place, and our neighbors want to live in a nice place. And we're the ones who've taken an oath, to basically make that happen. Because when you don't have law and order, and we don't have, a good system that kind of takes care of that, you have anarchy, and nothing works very well.
And a quick shout out to our partner with these episodes, New Gen Wellness Center. This is a facility focused on mental and physical wellness. They have lots of crisis stabilization programs, detox facilities. They don't believe that medication is always the answer. They focus extensively on an integrative approach to mental and physical well-being. They're fantastic. If you know somebody struggling, needing help with substance abuse, detox, any kind of mental health, reach out to New Gen Wellness Center. That's newgenwellnesscenter.com. Right. Have things changed at all as surrounding states had become more liberal, right? Because obviously, like I moved here at least in part from California because of the legal system, because I knew that you were going to have better law enforcement, that I knew would be a safer place for my children to grow up. I knew it was just going to be a better community in general and a safer community. Have things changed here as the surrounding states? I mean, obviously the coastal states have just kind of fallen by the wayside, and a lot of people are coming here, but it's 45 minutes to the Oregon border, right? Like you can drive to Oregon and get all kinds of drugs and then bring them back here very, very easily. Has that affected the violent crimes or the drug problem in Idaho very much, or is it just kind of par for the course?
I think it does have an effect. I mean, no matter how you look at it, when there's drugs that you can get that you can't get here and you can get them 45 minutes away, it's going to have an effect. But we've had issues in Idaho with regards to methamphetamine, with regards to cocaine, with regards to heroin, regards to all those things over all the time that I've been here. And for quite a distance before then, it's not new that those things occur, that those things are issues in society. What I see in terms of the push and the expectation sometimes is that people come in and say, hey, we're escaping from this place that's not doing well, and we're refugees, is what I hear, to Idaho. And then they're like, but you know what? Can you change this? And I'm thinking, whoa. not the best premise. I come from New York, grew up in the 70s and the 80s, went to school, dealt with the homeless crisis in New York in the mid 80s, 250,000 homeless people on the streets. So I know what the effect is. I've lived the effect of bad judgment and bad policies. And that was cleaned up in the 90s in New York. And we should learn a lesson from that. We should take a lesson from that and recognize that. But I think on the flip side of it, there's plenty of great and good people coming from California and Oregon, Washington, whatever their beliefs are, but they want to live in a safe place. And really everyone wants to live in a safe place. They want to raise their kids. They want to have a good life. And nobody wants to look over their shoulder. Brooklyn in the 70s, where I grew up, you're looking over your shoulder.
Right.
Your head is on a swivel. I don't want my kid to live that life.
Right. Right. This is kind of an unfair question, but you brought it up. What do people ask if you can change? Like, are there things that are like, hey, look, I'm glad it's safe and everything here, but like, can you just stop doing this, or can you like not care about that, or what would that be?
I don't know. It's just different things that people come up with in terms of, there's a bone, I guess, in some people's bodies that they want to be helpful, they want to be nice, they want to be,
sure,
they want to be compassionate, towards folks who are down and out. And I get that. And that, I think everyone has that. But I think the flip side of that is you have to have compassion with expectation. I think that combination has to be there. And unfortunately, when you grow up and you're inured in a notion that just keep giving compassion with no expectation and people will eventually snap out of it is kind of a fool's errand.
What do you mean compassion with expectation? Like what in a practical sense, what's that relationship?
It's what we have, when someone is in a bad spot, like I guess what I would like to chat about a bit with regards to drug use. Compassion is do what you can to help this person get off whatever they're on. Help them back up so they can live their life. But unfortunately, some of the choices that they've made have gotten them where they are. And we can talk about that because fentanyl's, as the topic, is a significantly addictive drug. And so there's aspects of that are really hard for people to lift themselves out of. Well, they need help to do that. And my thing is, I feel for them and I want to help them, but there has to be an expectation too. It can't simply be keep doing what you're doing until you feel like it's that time to change. And so that's what I look at it as.
So there has to be some form of obligation on their side to participate in a
Mhm.
meaningful long-term way.
I think that's everything in society that we do. Everyone participates with in some meaningful way.
Right.
You know, hey, I want police services, I want fire, I want sanitation, I want to have flush toilets, and I want water, and I want, you know, all these different things to happen behind the scenes. But at the same time, I don't want to pay taxes. There's an expectation. This is part of the whole expectation, you know. It's like I don't like to pay more than I have to, but there's a part of it where you have to pay to get these nice things that we have. And so
Sure.
there is an expectation in the fabric of society. And so the notion that it's a one-way street doesn't work.
Gotcha. You mentioned all of the classic drugs, right? Like heroin, methamphetamines. I mean, when I was growing up, my brother, my brother told me that the Pacific Northwest was always, you know, that's like methamphetamine capital of the world. Whether he was right or wrong, I have no idea. Again, it's a drug that I was familiar with from, you know, being warned from like the DARE program and other things growing up. But fentanyl really seemed to like jump into the mainstream and really take over the conversation as far as like, oh my God, you're gonna die, right? Like there was obviously the classic, what was it, like 1980, 1990, like your brain on drugs, or like, you know, crack and the fried egg and the whole thing. But the conversation is now changing. I mean, especially speaking with people like Representative Ted Hill. It's like, listen, when you have a fentanyl crisis, you don't even need to focus on rehabilitation centers, because the risk of death, accidental or otherwise, is so severe that it's almost like you don't grab people soon enough. The risk of some less severe drug, like let's say marijuana, right? Somebody gets illegal marijuana, not from the Oregon border, but from someone else just wandering around, it being laced with fentanyl. There's an actual real mortal risk there that people are starting to experience. When did this start coming in to Idaho and kind of jumping onto the radar?
So it helps to have a little bit of background on fentanyl itself. And so heroin has been around for a long time. Morphine has been around. All the opioids have been around in various forms for a long time. Fentanyl has been around for a long time as a synthetic opioid. What we saw back in the 70s and 80s when we had the Central American, the Colombians and those folks who were moving mass amounts of cocaine into the United States, there was a pathway, and the main pathway is through Mexico because it's a land route. Now, that doesn't say that they didn't come in by air, they didn't come in by ship, they didn't come through a ports, they came in through all kinds of methods.
Right.
Any way they can get this stuff in, because there's a giant market here of demand in the United States and Canada. And I think the statistic is that, you know, we have like 6% of the population of the world, we have 90% of the users. So it's insane. The demand is huge in the United States and has been for decades. Well, what happened was then those things came in. In the 90s, we started to see the methamphetamine exploding, and then the mom and pop lab. So it was kind of like, you know, like small business, basically, for lack of a better term. And we had massive numbers of labs that the DEA and Idaho State Police and other groups were all taking down.
Right. And these could be labs like in trailers in the woods somewhere. Right?
Yes.
Because like the operation can be very small.
Mhm.
You just need, you know, some cookware and whatnot. Very volatile, by the way. Like they blow up all the time, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And so there was a big push, a safety issue, and also just stopping the drug itself with the precursors, but also trying to push that out. Then around 2004, the cartels started taking over. And these are the Mexican cartels. And what they had was they already had the infrastructure in place because they were already trafficking on behalf of the Central American folks to get stuff in here. And then it became an issue of, well, why don't we produce this methamphetamine? And so then south of the border, meth overrid anything that the locals were doing. And so they took over that whole market. Then we had the opioid crisis where everyone's going towards popping pills because of overprescription.
Right.
And then as we pushed against that, then folks came about and tried to find heroin and other ways to satisfy that need that they had because they were already addicted. The cartels, they don't just exploit a market, they create one. And they created a market in fentanyl specifically. They learn from others. They learn from folks coming from overseas, coming from China, different areas where that was coming from in the synthetic side. But what they saw and what they seized upon was it's synthetic, so you don't rely on crops anymore. So there's no seasonal issue of getting a supply to the demand. You can buy it for a whole lot cheaper than you can getting a whole bunch of poppy to make heroin, to make fentanyl. It's 50 times to 100 times more highly addictive. And so what happens when you feed that into the market, which is what happened in the teens, you start to get people who are instantly hooked on it. And so this gets to some of the myths that people have in terms of like trying to understand that. But the reality of it is you had folks who targeted specifically to create users. And the reason we saw over the last half a decade all these little M30 oxycodone pills that are mimicked pills, they're not real, was because they started stamping these pills to basically addict the folks who were already addicted to the opioids and made it easier for them to say, oh, it's kind of like the pill that I had, and so I'll smoke this. And now it's gone to the point where there's an expectation that everything has fentanyl in it, because fentanyl is the addictive thing to sell your product on the market that is us. And so that's where that comes from. And so now the latest thing we're seeing just it's going back to powder, because no one is under the illusion anymore that it's an oxycodone and guessing what it is. There's anecdotes of individuals who, of dealers in the Northwest who are getting the test strips that are supposed to be used to test fentanyl to make sure it's not fentanyl. Oh, I don't want to touch fentanyl, to make sure it's fentanyl. That's where it's going. And the reason for that is it's so highly addictive. And that's why I bring up the compassion part in terms of addicts, because it's so incredibly addictive. It's very hard for them to get off of it. It doesn't mean they didn't have a say in it. It doesn't mean they didn't have a play in it. Sure. It doesn't mean they didn't participate in their own demise. What it means is that now they're in a hole that they need help getting dug out. But you also have to have an expectation too. It's got to be both sides. And so you have to have treatment, in my mind, and you have to also have the ability to hold people accountable by the law. You have to have incarceration. You have to have all those other things. Those other measures need to be in place too. And then you need to stop the demand. You need to deal with the demand in that way, and then the supply needs to be interdicted. And so that gets to the other issue of what's been a hot topic for a number of years for law enforcement, which is mandatory minimums, fentanyl deaths, those sorts of things.
Man, that's wild. So essentially you had a little, like you talked about, like kind of just homegrown market that was taken over by the big business of the cartel, and they did it far more effectively, cheaply, and it was more profitable and easy for them because they didn't have problems like you were mentioning, like bad crops. You don't have to grow anything. You don't have to have farmers. It's like, just get these chemicals, combine them appropriately, and deliver them. Okay, so entering into Idaho, then there are a lot of steps you have to go through. Like, you have to make it through some of the southern states, right? So you come from Mexico, you go into Arizona, you go into California, maybe Texas, and then you have to march all the way up here. It's my understanding, I've been told that Idaho in general is doing a better job than surrounding states and making it difficult or dangerous to be dealing drugs here. And that is winning at least part of the fight. It's not the whole fight, right? But it's like a small battle that we're winning, that people know if they get busted with something, some quantity of fentanyl in one of the surrounding states, it will be less severe and less damaging to their drug dealer career than it would be if they got busted in Idaho. Am I accurate on that?
You're absolutely correct. And that's one of those things that I was alluding to earlier in terms of how we handle things. We have expectations. We expect you don't do bad things, otherwise you're going to pay the punishment for it. And it's simple. And it's not, what's the old one, the war on drugs, and like we're, hard on crime. It's not like we're flexing our muscles being tough. It's simply being responsible and adults and having expectations of folks who do bad things in society. And that's all it really is. And in terms of people bringing stuff in and making it difficult, we have vehicle burgs where people go and they jockey box and they steal stuff out of your car.
Wait, what do you, a vehicle like somebody burglarizing your car, like stealing your,
exactly.
Back in the day, they used to steal the stereo, right?
Exactly.
Okay,
Whatever.
okay.
Yeah. Or the hubcap was
Right.
way back when they had hubcaps. So I can tell you stories about that, but now
I'm like vehicle burg. Like, am I missing something?
No.
Okay.
So
Okay. Keep going.
So
you're great.
You have vehicle burgs, and they'll go to your car, they'll open the door and they'll take your purse. They'll go in the car and they'll take your gun. They'll go in the car and take this, take that. Go to the next car, do the same thing. Every morning, somewhere in Idaho, and a lot of times in, the Treasure Valley, there's a series of vehicle burglaries, and and cops go out there, and an officer takes reports, and they look down the street because they look for other vehicles that were burgled, because there's going to be several, because they're going to go do it on a little spree. And invariably, it's always because no one locked their door. You gotta lock your door. If you just lock your door, criminals are generally lazy and they'll go to the next one. And so the vast majority of ones that I saw for years on patrol, and that every cop can tell you about, uh, is that people just don't do the most basic measure to protect their stuff. It's as simple as that. They make it obvious, they make it easy. Don't make it obvious, don't make it easy. And criminals tend to start going the other way, because they wouldn't be criminals if they were, fine,
Right.
upstanding, hardworking citizens. I mean, that's the reality of that's the paradigm of being a criminal. And so it's important to recognize that on a larger scale, that you have to create a circumstance where it's not fun and it's not pretty and it's not a happy thing at the end, that you come to Idaho, it's kind of like the old saying, you come on vacation, you leave on probation. Because it's designed to
Oh
be
my
like, hey,
God.
if you come here and you do bad crimes, we're going to do something about it. And we've seen it. I've seen it in my career so many times.
A lot of
Someone,
vacationers to Idaho? Like,
no,
what do
no,
you...
no. I'm saying people who come in who,
Yeah,
who have
yeah.
who basically are criminals,
Yeah.
and they do stuff here. We're hard on them,
Right.
as we should be. And so that's what it comes down to.
I was speaking with Sheriff Clifford recently, and he was making this joke about how he wasn't joking, but he was educating me about how crime and the jail populations are actually kind of seasonal. I was like, what in the hell are you talking about? Like, this isn't an orange growing season. He's like, no, but think about it. Idaho winter, we have a lot of transient crime. We have a lot of people that come in from out of state, and they don't want to come here in December. Like, they're going to wait till May or June. They're going to come in. They're going to get busted because Idaho has strong law enforcement, and people very much underestimate the capacity and will of the Idaho, state police and local police and sheriff departments and stuff. He's like, we hear people on the phone in jail being like, can you believe it? Like, I fucking got popped in Idaho. This is ridiculous. These fucking guys got me. And he's like, and I don't even know what to say. Like, no one ever said it was just, why did you come here?
Well, and that's what we get. I mean, I've experienced this. I can't tell you how many times, how many people I've put into jail over the years for very serious crimes, up to and including murder. And
whoa, watch out there,
Okay,
baby.
that was a
Watch out there,
hell.
baby. You're getting excited.
I'm using my hands to talk. Sorry about that. So, where I've had individuals, we had one, I remember one case in particular where some gang members did a drive-by shooting on a location, in Portland, and they shot an old lady in the back who was, in her 60s.
God.
And they got like 3 months in jail. They come here and they do some check frauds. They get 6 years in jail. I listen to the jail calls, and they're blown away constantly. Like, oh my God, I didn't think I'd even go to jail for this. That's what Idaho teaches people, is that we will hold you accountable. We will incarcerate you. It will not be a happy time. It will not be easy. And there's nothing wrong with that, I guess, is my point. I was asked by someone, like, hey, the prison crisis, and we have so many people in prison. I'm like, yeah, okay, what's wrong with that? If you have bad things happening in society, and there's individuals who I deal with, who I have built cases on and put in prison for a long, long time, you don't want them out victimizing your family, victimizing your kids. One of my mainstays was human trafficking investigations for 7 years. You don't want these people out there trafficking other human beings. So guess where they go? They go to prison. That's what we have for this in society. And on that side of it, there has to be an expectation that we're going to have to pay the piper for those things if we want to keep things nice. And so that's what should be. There should always be rehabilitation. When I was a gang detective, having out programs where someone can basically disown the gang, they can debrief out of the gang network that they've been in for 20 years, they can get their tattoos taken off, they could do all these things to become better members of society, upstanding members of society. They serve their time and be free. We want that. We want all of those things. But when they're in the midst of it and they're doing bad things to people, and they're running around shooting people and doing all kinds of stupid things and hurting people and intimidating people, guess what? We're going to be the ones pushing back and going, no, we're going to put you in prison. And so that's the reality of what law enforcement in Idaho, how our perspective on that.
Right. And I think a lot of people confuse these the problem with the prison population as the issue is not that there's a large number of people in prison. The issue is obviously far before that with what led to this type of behavior, what led to people being disenfranchised and feeling down and out, what led to all kinds of family dynamics that were damaging, right? Like what led to all of those other things. You can be mad and upset that there are people in prison. Like that's absolutely true. Like nobody's happy to send someone to prison. But you also need to not be happy that these crimes that are prison worthy are occurring, right? So it's like you're not just grabbing people off the street and being like, go to prison. You're grabbing people that obviously are suspected of committing a crime, and then they are indeed convicted of committing whatever the crime was, and then they are sentenced. It's like, okay, so what portion of them ending up in prison was my responsibility? Unless you're, falsely accusing people, which is not. Like that's not really part of the conversation, right? And like, yeah, that's a bad thing, but then those people go to prison. So the point is, it's a tricky thing. With talking about prison time, talking about mandatory sentencing, there's mandatory minimums for a lot of drugs already, right? And you have mandatory minimums for all kinds of crimes, right? Like there are mandatory minimums for lots of white collar crimes. It's not just violent crimes or drugs. But what are the unique aspects of the fentanyl fight that people are pushing back on to try to prevent fentanyl from hitting mandatory minimums?
So we've been fighting the fight as the Fraternal Order of Police for a decade now, basically pushing back against folks who want to reduce or eliminate mandatory minimums. They'll make the argument that it should be only judicial discretion. They'll make the argument that we're getting people who are not really bad people in there. They'll bring examples of folks. They'll parade someone up there, say this person is really nice and pretty, and here's a great picture of them, and they didn't do anything, and their grandmother swears on it. Well, I love your grandma, but the reality of those cases is not the fantasy that they portray. And so, unfortunately, there's a part of it where, yeah, we don't want anyone in prison who should not be there, period. Our system, especially with regard to our drug laws, gives people chance after chance after chance after chance. They're going to see a judge a half a dozen times before they end up in prison for something. There's going to be, 90% of all cases are pled down. They're going to be pled down. There's so many aspects in the system. We created drug courts in Idaho in 1999. We have Veterans Court. We have Domestic Violence Court. We have all these courts that understand the paradigm that people are going through when they're using drugs or doing these other things. And we have a good evidence-based, responsive way of handling that. This is not a mystery. This has been around for 2.5 decades. This is something that we do. It's something that's incorporated in the system and how it works. But there's a point in time where, especially with mandatory minimums, and we're talking about fentanyl specifically, where you're taking an individual who is trafficking in fentanyl, bringing it up into the state is what that means. And that's not someone's dumb cousin or some idiot. They know it's fentanyl. They know they're making money on it, and they're bringing something and everyone knows that fentanyl is deadly. It's not a big guess. It's not a surprise.
And I don't mean to interrupt, but just real fast, like you have to prove that they knew it too, right? Like
they knowingly brought it into the state.
Right. So people are like, well, what if it's in like a suitcase that they won on somebody said this. They're like, what if you win a trip to, like Idaho or something, and you get free luggage and it has like 20 pounds of fat and you didn't know? It's like, okay, but you still have to go before a judge and a jury and say like, okay, prove beyond a burden of a doubt that, they actually knowingly did this.
There's some nice fantasies that could happen. And Martians could come down and bring it in too. I mean, it's just it's silliness when people talk about that, because that's not a reality.
Right.
It's not the reality that you don't know anyone and you had a whoopsie and you brought something in. Right. And then people who are in the state who are distributing it amongst their friends, amongst their enemies, amongst whoever. I don't know who they are. I don't care.
Right.
But they're distributing something that does the same thing. They knowingly know that it's fentanyl. I had a case here involving some late teens who were, juvenile, just turned adult. And they, in this particular case, it involved a shooting and an injury and drug-on-drug crimes and a bunch of different things without getting specific about it.
That's pretty specific, but that's okay.
It's way more specific than that. I'm trying to be
okay. Look, you're good. You're good.
You can generic this one a little bit.
Okay.
But this is the real example of everything I kept hearing from folks was, oh, it's Adderall, it's Adderall, it's Adderall. They all knew it was fentanyl. They were all using fentanyl. I could show you on their text messages on their phone that they were selling Fetty. So it's not, they claim it's Adderall because they know Adderall can be it's a prescription drug and it's a misdemeanor to if you have it in the wrong bottle. It's not the same thing. They're minimizing it because of the danger of fentanyl. Everyone knows that fentanyl is bad. And when individuals are distributing it and they're giving it, their job every day is to go around town and sell death to a member of your family. That is their job. And people say, well, they didn't mean it. They didn't intend for something to happen. I asked them this. If someone is an alcoholic and they're drunk and they leave their house, and they have a house, and they drive to the liquor store, and on the way to the liquor store, they kill one of your family members. Did they mean to? No. But do they have to pay for that? Yeah. That's the reality of it. The reality is that what their actions are, they have an effect. And to say that someone's just supporting their own habit by giving out something that they know is a killer and then killing somebody isn't cool. And someone who is dealing it, you don't become a dealer by putting it on your credit card. You don't become a dealer by going down to some place where they're selling and go, hey, give me 800 pills and I'll do it. That's not the relationship. That's not how it works. How it works is you have a relationship that's built on an expectation and fear, because they're going to front you these drugs, and if you don't give them back, you're going to be hurt physically or killed. This is not a transaction at TJ Maxx. This is a whole different ball game. And so people need to put it into the paradigm that it is. And finally, the other one that I always hear is, well, what if they're, we need a law what if they're a first-time dealer? No one's a first-time dealer. I'm sorry. That doesn't exist. Look at DUIs, to bring the alcohol example back. The statistics nationally are the average DUI driver who has driven a .08 or above has done it more than 80 times before they got caught once by a cop. There's no first-time dealers. That doesn't exist. And the notion that people aren't knowingly doing that, it's also kind of silly. So, and there's many more. There's many more kind of dopey examples out there.
Yeah, I've also heard the argument that as a deterrent, it doesn't actually work because people don't research what the mandatory minimums are for certain crimes. So it's like the argument that, hey, we need to make this mandatory minimum and that will deter people presupposes like this legal research that people go through. And they're like, well, which crime should I commit today? Well, this one, well, I'll just do that. It's like, how long would it take for people to figure out that it's like, oh, they just changed the law? Like if it's your business to commit crimes, you're probably going to know like, okay, if I commit this crime, like you don't have to know the legal handbook. Like you just need to know, hey, look, don't get caught with this because it's real bad.
All you need to know is it might take them a few minutes to figure it out, but what we call jailhouse lawyers, which is everyone else in the pod, the other 80 dudes, when someone gets arrested. That kind of news, that kind of information moves like wildfire. People know not to come to Idaho with a lot of things because they know how the laws are here. There's plenty of examples of high-level traffickers and dealers who don't come into Idaho because they don't mess with Idaho, because they know they're going to go to jail and they're not going to get out. It's as simple as that, and they can't run their business and they can't do anything when they're on the inside. They have to be on the outside. Jailhouse lawyers are in every jail in the state of Idaho, and a jailhouse lawyer is the person bunking next to you. This is their game. This is what they do. They know what the penalties are. They advise each other on what those things are. They're not looking up in a law book. They're not going to the law library to do it. Maybe they're Googling it. Who knows? But the bottom line is we have expectations about those things. People know not to rob people at gunpoint, and if they do, they're going to pay for it. People know not to murder people, and they know what the expectation is if they do. It's the same thing. People do figure that out. They're not idiots. They're not geniuses, but they're not idiots either. And so to have this expectation, it's kind of like the old saying that ignorance of the law is not an excuse.
Right.
The message does get out. And I mean, the entire Northwest knows that Idaho is that island where even marijuana is not legal yet.
Right.
So.
Right. And again, for something to be a deterrent, you don't have to know every single nuance, right? you, you know, if you're dealing in fentanyl, that's going to be bad. You know, if you're dealing in heroin, that's going to be bad. Now, how bad is bad? Yeah, maybe the quantity and all these different things might change slightly, but it's bad, right? And beyond that, it's like there's some people that will take the risk and won't be deterred by it, and that's their decision, and that's an unfortunate decision if they do choose that. But bottom line is like people are going to know. What one other thing though, you touched on it. The mandatory minimums for something like fentanyl takes the discretion away from a judge and puts it in the hands of the police or the prosecutor. Now, people make the argument that that leads to racial discrimination and racial bias, right? But it's crazy to me because mandatory minimums were kind of designed, at least in part. So it's like, let's not let people off. Like if there's some, attractive looking Caucasian dude, blonde hair, blue eyes, straight and narrow, and he gets off, and then you have some scruffy looking dude like, me or you on our bad days, because we're not bad. But anyway, on our bad days, we show up and they're like, those guys need to go to prison. The mandatory minimums don't care what the person looks like. The mandatory minimums takes all that discretion away. So like, look, if you're caught doing this and you're charged with this thing, then you go, this is your mandatory minimum. Do you think there's a problem with discretion on the police and the prosecutor side? Because again, it takes the potential for bias away from the judicial system and puts it in the hands, or excuse me, at least from the judge, and puts it in the hands of the police and the prosecutor. So the police and the police department and then the prosecutors get to decide, are we going to charge somebody with this thing that carries a mandatory minimum or not? Is there any evidence that there's bias bleeding into that process?
No, there's nothing that I've seen in my doing this work. Nothing. It's one of those things where there was a bias that was recognized back in the 80s for mandatory minimums for possession and for basically users of crack cocaine, because the amount of crack cocaine that someone would use, it was $5 a hit, as opposed to the same amount that someone who had money would use for cocaine, powder cocaine, 50 or $100 a hit. And so it was a whole different ballgame in terms of upper middle class, mostly white, that was a cocaine crowd. Lower income, black, Hispanic, my neighborhood where I grew up,
Right,
was the crack, epidemic. And that's where that happened. And so we had mandatory minimums that were disparate. And so that was recognized, and there was moved to change that. And that was the reason for that, because it wasn't quantified. The same quantity of cocaine didn't carry the same penalty as the same quantity of crack.
but this is something from almost 40 years ago.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying. Those are good arguments in terms of don't let that be the issue, but that doesn't mean they hold true today.
So there's no evidence that that is playing out. Like there's no white versus, like I'm Mexican, all right? So there's no white versus Mexican drug that like one has a 1-year mandatory minimum, one has a 10.
No. And the statistics don't match that. And that's the thing. That's where it comes, ultimately, what it comes down to is there's no basis for saying that is the case. To answer the other question you had in terms of discretion for law enforcement, for
Right.
prosecutors, as opposed to judges, it's a tool. It's a tool to slow down supply. That is the reason for it. But there's plenty of avenues to not deal with the mandatory minimum in terms of the discretion of the prosecutors. Because what we do in drug investigations, we ladder up to the next level. That's how it works. And that's one of the problems I think they're having, like for instance in Oregon with the law that was passed in 2020, that M110. By decriminalizing, it took away all of the incentive for users to say, hey, here's my dealer, and I'll help you prove it. It takes away that incentive. Mandatory minimums are an incentive to do so.
So essentially, and Ted Hill actually talked about this briefly. Essentially, what you have is a greater hammer to hit somebody over the head with and say like, hey, look, we have you for this. You got 100 pills in your bag. This is the mandatory minimum that comes along with that. We can prove that you knew it, this stuff. We're looking at your text messages. So we got you dead to rights, right? So you can either participate with us and help us move up the ladder, find distributors, find dealers, get the bigger fish and do more damage to the drug supply chain, or you can go away for this thing. If you don't have the capacity to negotiate with that mandatory minimum, where the mandatory minimum doesn't exist at all, right? It's not just that it's with a judge, but it doesn't exist at all. You don't have the capacity to work up the chain of command.
No, there's no penalty. There's no mandatory minimums set clear expectations as to, if I do this, I'll end up here. And there's no wiggling out of it unless I can do something to help out. And that's ultimately what we want. I mean, quite frankly, we want people to come forward when there's a gang problem. We want people to come forward and tell us that, hey, I can help you stop the flow of this. We want people to come forward and tell us the good things about people too, by the way. Hey, this person needs help. All those things that we do as cops, we want that participation in there. And it does help that.
There's another argument, and I'm sorry to kind of hit you with these. It's just, in trying to understand this, you hear a lot of different things, right? You hear some people saying, it's discretion for the police and the police are dirty, or things like that. There was another argument saying essentially what happens is, because mandatory minimums are so severe, you have an incredible amount of pushback from guilty criminals or people that are afraid of being indicted, essentially. So do you see that to be the case? Like, as you have mandatory minimums develop, do you get more pushback from people, and does it actually drain the resources of the court system and the public defenders and things of that nature?
I think the pushback, that we're seeing pushback from the extremes. The extremes on the left, the extremes on the right are the ones who are pushing back.
Sure.
For different reasons. One is that it's unfair, cops are bad. It's a system that's designed to have certain people fail, which it's not. And then from the other side, it's free market, don't spend any money on anything. And the more you have mandatory minimums, the more expectation you're going to spend money on prisons, and you're going to spend money on that. My answer is, you're going to spend money anyway, because they're going to be burgling your house and hurting your family, and we're going to have to do something about that. And that's the thing. And kind of like I said a little bit earlier, everything in society, there's an expectation. You have all these nice services. You have, we have police, and you have fire, and you have sanitation, and the water turns on, the toilet flushes. It's because you pay taxes. There is a piece of that. It's not unheard of. It's not understood. And most people, which is the vast majority of people in the middle, 80% plus, understand that and live their lives that way, and they expect that. And everyone wants a safe society. And I think, as far as the pushback goes, yeah, that's fine. And in the most basic level, there's nothing wrong with the pushback, because people are speaking their minds and they're giving opinions on it. I might not agree with them, and there's plenty of silly examples that we hear, because they don't have an understanding from living inside this world that we live in as law enforcement, where we actually are that thin blue line doing the work. We're the boots on the ground. We see the nuance of it, and that's the thing that we talk about. But our job is to, protect everybody in the best way that we can. And our experience tells us that these are the best ways to do it. These are the ways that are effective, that do work. Mandatory minimums do get people's attention who are doing bad crimes. The difference, I think, for some of the argument that you'll hear from the past, which we touched on, is that you don't have mandatory minimums for users. You make a very clear delineation between what makes someone a user of an illicit drug and a distributor or a trafficker. And that's very critical. And so that's where the quantities come into play, in terms of 100 pills, 250 pills, 500 pills, something that users don't have, because to do that, they wouldn't have the product. They're not dealing it. They're simply getting 5, 6, 7. That's what they're getting. That's the reality that we see. And so levels for heroin, as an example, we've raised our expectation of those, because sometimes folks,
like buy in bulk?
No, not in bulk. No. Their tolerance goes up. So the number of grams, there's a little movement on those things, because we see how people physiologically, what your typical user needs and has.
So you guys modified the mandatory minimum threshold for users, or excuse me, not the mandatory minimum, but the argument for dealer versus user with heroin, based on, hey, look, somebody actually may work up a tolerance, so this person is buying more than we would have originally accounted for, but they're still a user because. Correct. Man, talk about compassion. That's wildly compassionate.
So that was the bill that came up last year that we supported, which specifically did that. And The problem is we get a lot of pushback from folks saying we just get rid of them all. And it's really kind of silly. Or we'll get folks saying, well, we maybe we should do it for fentanyl and then get rid of the other ones. I'm like, no, because those are going to come back in 2 years. I mean, it's just it's a game of like trying to play a horse trade on it. It's not a horse trade. It's trying to figure out.
Hang on a sec. You're having a hard time with this mic because you keep pushing it away too. So the bottom line is you guys. Wait, what happened to that bill last year?
It held in committee. It held in committee because there was so much pressure to not go forward with it, and so it held. And so you talked to Ted about that. He's going to be bringing something, I'm sure. This is a battle we've been fighting for a while, and so to get to the gist of why we care, one is all the things I've said with regards to have expectations, to make it clear that we don't tolerate people distributing or trafficking fentanyl in the state of Idaho. Go somewhere else, basically, is what it comes down to. But also on kind of, moving that forward.
Well, look, I'll tell you why you care. Because one, the potential for fatal catastrophes with the new lines of synthetic opioids is like skyrocketing. Right? Like Ted talked about his nephew dying from a fentanyl overdose. It's like, I've never heard of anyone I know dying from like a marijuana overdose. And I'm not saying marijuana should be legal. Like, please be clear on this. Like, fine, keep it illegal, totally fine. But the risk associated with it, not the same thing. And yeah, maybe it's a gateway drug and that's really bad too. But bottom line is, like, from that direct thing, I've never heard of anyone transpiring unless it's laced with like fentanyl or something. So the concern, when I worked with teenagers, right, the 16, 17-year-olds, I'd really give them a hard time about drugs because in California, specifically, like marijuana and whatnot were becoming very legal and very common. So kids would get, gummies or edibles or just something dumb. And they'd, of course, think it would be hilarious to take it at like homecoming or, whatever. So I had this one rugby group that I worked with a lot of kids on the rugby team, and they were going to this trip. They were flying to Oregon. And of course, the idiots that they were thought it'd be hilarious to drop gummies before getting on the plane. It's like, why you want to be stoned on an airplane with your dad and like all of your dad's friends and then all of you, like, I have no idea. And of course, they had no idea how much to take. So they just popped these gummies, and 30 minutes later, some dude's crying in the corner, this like 220-pound rugby dude, just losing his mind. The dads realize instantaneously, like, oh, son of a bitch. Because all of them, like, they can't even walk straight. They grab him, they take him home. They're really pissed at him. So we'd get into these conversations. That was one specific example, but spurred conversations, not uncommon to talk to people about this. And the thing that it would always come back to is the worst thing you could do to scare someone is there was this program where you could input somebody's photo and it would like it was like a filter, and they'd modify the filter or modify the photo through the filters to make it look like somebody had been smoking meth or doing meth forever, right? So like their face is all hollow and their teeth are falling out and they got acne and all this stuff. That was the worst thing I could do to scare them. And by the way, it worked. They were like, wow, that's really bad. But I couldn't be like, hey, the kid died, right? Like, you cried in an airport, her incisor fell out, that guy died. That's such a horrifying possibility that's just floating around now.
Well, and that's the sad part about fentanyl. I mean, that is the thing. It's known to be deadly. It's known to be highly addictive, and it can kill you. And our death rate in terms of overdose rates since 2014 have skyrocketed in the United States. And they've skyrocketed since 2018, 2019 with the fentanyl epidemic when it's come to Idaho. And it's insane. But it's one of those things where, so we have to do something about that. And, you struggle with this because you're like, okay, there's free will. People decide to do whatever. But it's so highly addictive. They're no longer in that realm. They're no longer in that world of decision making when it comes to the user. And that's why we're compassionate about the user. They're in a place where they use fentanyl and they continue to seek it out. They continue to make sure their test strips are telling them, hey, this is fentanyl, for the purpose of not going through the withdrawals and the pain of that. And if the pain of that is so profound, why would they go any other way? I can't tell you how many times I've sat in the jail interviewing folks, And I remember one specific one, an 18-year-old girl who I had helped out with regards to human trafficking. She was also using meth at the time, was her drug of choice. And it was a long, wild trip for 2 months of all kinds of really bad stuff that happened to her. But she was still a user and still an addict. And she told me at the end when we were talking about, her addiction in relation to all this, she's like, when I get out of here, I'm going to use again. I can't not use again. This is like, I'm an addict and I can't change that, basically. And so people get to such an extreme, and that's, I guess, the point I was trying to make, was it's not just to prevent people from bringing the stuff, trafficking and bringing stuff into the state, but it's also to give a leg up to the folks who are users who need the help. And that needs to be part of it. But again, without an expectation that they help themselves. That's why we have drug court. That's why we have rider programs, to get someone to the point where they try to get off the stuff. Sometimes the only detox they're going to have is we put them in jail. That's the only place they're going to get that, because that drug now is so powerful and it can kill you so easily. And so do we care about our fellow members of society, who've fallen under the bus, basically? Are we going to help them up? Are we going to do something about that? And so that's the side of it too. That's the side of why we are pushing for mandatory minimums. That's why we think they're a good thing, because it helps us give us that gap. And also, we want to see help for the individuals who have the problem, but we're not going to facilitate, and we're not going to enable, like they're doing in some places in the United States, enable someone to bring in illegal drugs and use the drugs in a safe way. I mean, that's just, to me, that's the height of silliness, quite frankly, which kind of talks about the whole harm reduction,
Right.
issue.
Right.
Where harm reduction was originally back, in the 80s and 90s, so that people who were intravenous drug users wouldn't contract AIDS. There was a big reason as to why. And there's other things that, of course, IV users can do, but people are smoking fentanyl. They're tracing the dragon on a piece of foil. So they're not exchanging needles. Harm reduction shouldn't be their emotional harm, in my book, in my personal opinion. And it's not harm from consequences, and it's not harm from having to deal with, basically withdrawals. That's just pain avoidance. That's just consequence avoidance in my book. And that's the sad part about it. And, it's, and I guess the experiment in Portland and in Oregon will shake out, and people will be able to look at it with clear eyes down the road. But the signs are already that they're not getting, people are not signing up for treatment because there's no expectation. And when there's no expectation, then they'll keep going down the road of avoiding the pain of withdrawal. And that's it.
Right.
And so at what point do you expect something?
Right.
And so that's part of it.
Yeah. And again, your point of user versus dealer trafficker for mandatory minimums, it's such an important piece, which is, hey, it's actually compassionate for the end user, and taking into account the end user and the plight they're in, to have mandatory minimums for the dealer, for the trafficker, because then you can eliminate their capacity to acquire, you can eliminate the user's capacity to acquire this drug, and hopefully get just a slight reprieve and get their life back on track.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing about the 50 states is that it's like, look, if Oregon's right, then we'll find out. And if Idaho's right, we're going to find out. And if San Francisco's right, which I really doubt, we'll find out. So fine. It's like this incredible social experiment that they're running. And it's horrible and depressing to see people go through this.
Yeah,
Like,
but to put people through that and continue, it's not compassionate to let people live endlessly on the street and then die there. There's nothing compassionate about that.
Right.
And so that's where it's like, you try a different experiment, but when it's not working, it ain't working. Switch doctors. I mean, I'm sorry, but you go for your knee problem and nothing's helping and it's getting worse, and you get a second opinion. You do something different. You don't just keep doing the same thing, that gives you the same bad result.
did you see The Simpsons from like 25 years ago? Homer, he falls over a trash can, or like Flanders trips over a trash can or something, and he's like, oh, and his back cracks. He's like, that's amazing. And Homer makes a back repair system, like around this trash can, and people come into his house, and he just pushes people over the trash can. And the chiropractors show up and like break his trash can and like tell them, everyone's like, they tell everyone like, listen, I know I can make your back feel better. You just have to come see me 3 times a week for the rest of your life. And they're like, oh, okay.
Or just go see Homer once.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
But that's why they blew up the trash can.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
it was pretty. That was like late 90s. So,
Oh yeah. No,
it
I
just-
remember that. I was a fan. So.
Yeah, big time.
Oh, yeah.
Well, listen, Mike, we've been chatting for a long time. It's late. I appreciate you coming. We've talked about a lot of things. Is there anything you'd like to hit in closing?
No, I just what I ask is people, think about this issue, see how they feel about it, and I think we're on the side of most Idahoans, quite frankly, on any side of the spectrum, that they want a safe place to live. They want a place to raise their kids. They don't want their kids, their family members, their spouses, or someone they know to die. And if you've seen as much death as I have as a violent crimes detective, and we go on a lot of bodies, you don't want to see that. And you don't want it to be personal, especially. And if you care about it, let your legislators know, because that's a big deal. I mean, that's what it comes down to. They need to hear from you what you actually feel. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to this wingnut or that wingnut. Listen to your, talk to your legislators so they understand how you feel about this. And hopefully that'll help make a change and help keep Idaho a great place to live. Because as far as law enforcement in Idaho, we want this place to be a great place to continue to live. We want this place to be a safe place for folks, and their families, because we live here. That's our vested interest, is it's our community. And we see it from the inside, and we see it from, like we talked about, from the nuance of what these things, what the effect they can have. And so, look out for each other.
God bless you, Mike. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you coming. Hopefully first of many. And a quick shout out to our partner with these episodes, New Gen Wellness Center. This is a facility focused on mental and physical wellness. They have lots of crisis stabilization programs, detox facilities. They don't believe that medication is always the answer. They focus extensively on an integrative approach to mental and physical well-being. They're fantastic. If you know somebody struggling, needing help with substance abuse, detox, any kind of mental health, reach out to New Gen Wellness Center. That's newgenwellnesscenter.com.